Good afternoon, sir. This afternoon, we'll discuss about the 14 learner-centered of principle. And one of those are nature of the learning process. Nature of the learning process, it is a complex subject, is most effective when it is intentional process of constructing meaning from information and experience. So when we talk about nature of the learning process, it's talk about your experience. So one of example here is that, just like for example, Sir Marvy. Si Sir Marvy ay nagtuturo. But, meron siya mga gestures. And those gestures ay nasusunod naming mga estudyante kahit na kahit hindi kami obligadong gawin ang mga ginagawa mong gestures. So, yan po yung example ng nature of the learning process. And one of example here is clapping. May classmate po akong nagka-claps na kahit hindi ko po gustong gawin, but it is a nature to me to sundin ka at gawin ko rin yung claps na yon. So, the second one is goal of a learning process. Goal of a learning process is a successful learner over time and with support and instructional guidance can create meaningful, coherent representation of knowledge. So, goal of learning process is talk about it is allow your student focus on what they supposed to learning. So we have here a so the second one here is goals of a learning process. Goals of a learning process is the successful learner over time in which support and instructional guidance can create meaningful, coherent representation of knowledge. So, goals of a learning process, it's talk about allow your student to focus on what they supposed to learning. So, we have here a short-term goals and long-term goals. So, when we talk about short-term goals, it's talk about, kunyari, short-term goals. Ito yung mga goals mo for the whole weekend. So, kunyari, sa whole weekend na to, gusto mo yung goals na yan, mag-ipon ka para may pang-gala ka. Ayun yung short-term goals. But when we talk about long-term goals, ito yung mga long-term goals, yung mga pangarap for the future. One of the example here is ako. So, ako yung pangarap ko is teacher. But, hindi lang po ako nakastick sa pagiging teacher. But I want to become a teacher in Thailand, not here in Philippines. So, yan po yung example ng goals of a learning process. Let's talk about your goals in life. So, the third one here is construction of knowledge. Construction of knowledge is the successful of learner can link new information with existing knowledge in meaningful ways. So, construction of knowledge, it's talk about active process that happens through individual or social engagement or solve problems and make decision, study and apply what they have learned. So one of the example here in construction of knowledge is ang ginagawa ko po ngayon. So, ang ginagawa ko po ngayon is nag-study ako, so that nag-study po ako at ginagawa ko po ito ngayon. Ina-apply ko po at dinidiscuss ko sa inyo. Ito po yung construction of knowledge. So, proceed po tayo sa number 4. Here is the strategic thinking. Strategic thinking is the successful learner can create and use of repertoire of thinking and reasoning strategies to achieve complex learning goals. So, strategic thinking, it's talk about in everyday life. So, one of the example here is, siguro ako na lang po. So, one of the example here is, before I go to the school, so i-check ko po kung ano yung mga nakalimutan ko. Pamasahe ko, cellphone, notebook, mga baon ko, or pera ko. Ayun po yung strategic thinking. You always check before you go. Yan po yung example ng strategic thinking. And proceed tayo sa number 5. Thinking about thinking. Thinking about thinking is higher order strategies for selecting and monitoring mental operations, facilitate creative and critical thinking. So when we talk about thinking, it's all about metacognition. So the second one is thinking about thinking. Thinking about thinking is higher order strategies for selecting and monitoring mental operations, facilitate creative and critical thinking. So when we talk about thinking, it's talk about metacognition. Metacognition, katulad po ng pinag-aralan natin dati. So, metacognition is, or thinking about thinking is, thinking beyond your thinking. So, iniisip mo po kung ano pa yung nasa isip mo. Ayun po yung example ng thinking about thinking. Thinking about thinking. So, one of the example here is, nag-study ka, but it is not enough na nag-study ka lang. But you have to think beyond what are you thinking about. So, yun po yung thinking about thinking. So, the next one is context of learning. Context of learning is influenced by environmental factors, including culture, technology, and instructional practices. So, when we talk about context of learning, it is talk about your cultures or belief, or cultural, or the student perception. Katulad po ng, one of the example here is, katulad po ng mga IP. So the second one here is context of a learning. Context of a learning is a learning influenced by environmental factors, or including culture, technology, and instructional practices. So one of the example here is IP. So So the next one here is context of a learning. The learning is influenced by environmental factors, including culture, technology, and instructional practices. Ay, mali. So the next one here is context of a learning. So context of a learning, it is influenced by environmental factors, including culture, technology, and instructional practices. This context of a learning process, it's talk about your perceptions. So one of the example here is IP. So ang mga IP dati po ay nagsusuot po sila ng mga traditional dresses nila. So because of technology, because of trends na nagaganap po ngayong panahon na to, so hindi na po sila nakapagsusuot ng mga traditional na dress nila. So nagsusuot na po sila ng mga trending katulad mga crop top, sexy shorts. Yun po yung context of a learning process. So the seven, ay mali. So next is motivational and emotional influence on learning. So this is the learner's creativity, higher order thinking, and natural curiosity. All contribute to So the next one here is motivational and emotional influence on learning. So it is what and how much is learned is influenced by the learner's motivation. Motivation to learn, in turn, is influenced by the individual's emotional states, beliefs, interests, and goals, habits of thinking. So, motivational and emotional influence on learning, let's talk about learner's natural curiosity, or natural curiosity po. So, when we talk about motivational and emotional influence, so one of the example here is, you want to become a teacher. So, motivational is not about sila, minimotivate ka nila. But motivational, it's talk about yourself. Because motivation is, nakadepende ka sa sarili mo. So katulad na lang, gusto mo na maging teacher, but you have to study hard. You have to, what you call this, you have to, you have to study hard because you want to become a teacher, because that is your goal, right? So that is motivation. Namamotivate mo yung sarili mo kasi gusto mo maging teacher. So yun po yung example ng motivational and emotional influence on learning.
Intrinsic motivation to learn in yourself. The learner's creativity, higher order thinking, as natural curiosity, and contribute to motivation to learner. The intrinsic motivation is the knowledge of an student have starts with themselves, and the knowledge is example, he or she learn in their house, and every student have own knowledge, and they start in themselves. So effects of the motivation and efforts. So effects of motivation and efforts is an individual have uh, acquisition of complex knowledge and skills requires standard extended learners efforts and guidance practice without learners motivation. So if the students or learners have no motivation uh, and efforts, so that no have learning no have learning and progress. So for example is, if the students have an exam but she or he not studies, so that he get low scores in their exams, because without the of motivation in individuals or the students. Developmental and social factors. Developmental influence on learning. So as individuals develop their different opportunities and contrast, for learning is the most effective when develop differential development within across physical, intellectual, and emotional and social domains in taken into account. So every student have an developmental intelligence, and uh, if the student or learners have different uh, opportunities to learn and have own talent or learning in their styles, and the students have own learning process, and if the intelligence across the developmental and across physical, intellectual, and emotional and learning social domains is, if uh, all students have own talent and own knowledge, so that if he across the students learn more and more in their studies. Social influence on learning is learning and influenced by social interaction and international in personal relationship with communities and others. Social influence is the learners, if the learners learn to their families and friends, he applies in their personal and so in their personal learning. So what is the behavior with others, so the learners he applied in their selves and attitude. Individual difference factors is individual difference in learning is learners have different strategic approach and capabilities for learning that are influence function and prior experience and heredity. So learners have different strategies to learn and capabilities for learning. So if the students have um, different function and prior knowledge to learn, and an individual are born with development and social and learning. So uh, the learners of the learning of an individuals have born and have capabilities to learn and to uh, learn better. Learning and diversity effective with difference learning in linguistic culture and social backgrounds and taken into account. So learning is effectively in difference in learning language. So if uh, an individual or students have learning and with different cultures or backgrounds, so that the learners learn effectiveness. If for example, if uh, students have different learning, so that learning and cultures, so that the learners, however the language is ethically, race, beliefs, and economic status of influence on learning, careful and attention, so that the learners preserve that their individual difference in abilities, backgrounds, and cultures. Standards and assessment settings approach higher challenging standards and assisting with learners as well as learning progress, including the dynamic processes and outcomes. So standards is if the students or teachers have standards to learn, so that the learning progress is including, so the if uh, the teacher or student have a standards, so that in the assessment, so that the learning strategies or learning is progress, and the learners have more learning and uh, important information to both learner and to their teacher at all stage of the learning process. Effective learning intake can learners feel in challenges in the to work, so that if the teacher give the standards higher grades, so the learners have standards the learning to improve or to give the best to learn more and better.